You and I with Rashmi Shetty is a human library audio podcast bringing in stories of people you and I can draw inspiration from. Welcome to the third season of this amazing story listening journey. Ordinary folks, extraordinary lives, their uniqueness and individuality, making them interesting to talk to and to listen to, each one of them completely connected to the voice in me and with motivational stories of moving beyond themselves to make a difference in the world. A reaffirmation of the fact open your eyes wider. The world is far more beautiful when we acknowledge the presence of both you and I. The 10th of October is observed world over as World Mental Health Day. On this episode of You and I with Rashmi Shetty, the Human Library audio podcast, we have someone whose work beautifully reflects the theme of the day. Fauzia Naqvi, a dedicated psychologist with over 12 years of experience across hospitals, corporates, and private practice. With more than 4,700 supervised clinical hours, she's supported clients through grief, stress, addiction, workplace burnout, and relationship challenges. Her approach is trauma informed, DBT informed, and draws from the Rogerian and narrative therapy, always empathetic and client centered. Fauzia holds a postgraduate degree in counseling psychology from TIS and a master's in HR management from the University of Allahabad, with additional certifications in addiction management and community mental health from NIMHANS. Multilingual in Hindi, Urdu, English, and able to understand Gujarati, she brings in a cultural sensitivity to everything that she does, from one on one sessions to facilitating workshops and webinars. Listen in as Fauzia shares her journey, her stories, and her tips to take care of our mental health. Hi, Fauzia. Such a pleasure having you on You and I with Rashmi Shetty.
Thanks, Rashmi.
It has been an honor for me after listening to you on Lenny's podcast of amazing work that you do. And before we get to the work that you do, I would love to know what Little Fauzia is all about and what were your influences? Where were you born? Where were you brought up?
That's quite a long journey, Anne. So the Fauzia you're talking to right now is sitting in our hometown, is sitting exactly in the home and the house that she was born and brought up in, which is in Allahabad. I've been born here. My paternal side, my maternal side, they all hail from the city called Allahabad. And my parental home is still here in Allahabad, where I'm right now. I'm on a work break right now, and it's a great time to connect with you here. So the little Fauzia that you're talking about was born in a family which was quite politically very aware, politically very astute, were a lot into, like, from generations has been focusing a lot on women's education, focusing a lot on societal change, on, working with change makers in different ways. Pre-independence against the government and post-independence with the government and non-governmental organizations as well, in different ways. I was raised in a joint family, in a very loving family of grandparents, an aunt, my aunt's husband, parents, another of my father's cousin, and two of my older siblings. So we were three of us. Right? Thanks to my maternal grandmother, who insisted that my mother and all her brothers and sisters, they go to a convent school in that era. She insisted that time. My mother said that the family, they all went to the brothers went to a boys missionary school and the girls went to an all-girls convent school, which was honestly in a city like Allahabad, and that too in a Muslim family, staying in the city side, not in the colonial civilized side, was quite a major step forward. Because my maternal side studied there, my mother also insisted that we three also studied in the same school. So we went to the same school as my mother and my other aunts. In Allahabad, at least, it's quite a big thing to be admitted. The school name is St. Mary's Convent. And that school, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we started in 1867. That's such an old school. I'm not that old, but the school is 1867. So now I think the school and my family, they instilled a lot of what is called as thoughtfulness, of observation, of not just being a consumer, of not just taking things, not just using, but being involved in the process, in asking the hows, in asking the whys, in getting to know about people, people's stories. Anybody who's been listening to this podcast would be aware that in all convent schools there's something called moral science period, which is mandatory. Even if you have a next time you have a board exam, even of mathematics, that period will never ever be shifted for anything else. So 6 days a week we used to have mandatorily the moral science period. And of course, the school taught us many things. But as we grew up, especially from 9th to 12th, I remember, the teachers used to talk a lot about what we now call as sexuality education. They used to talk about what is safe, what is unsafe. They used to call what is also help us understand the changes in adolescence, not only from a physiological point of view, but also from a psychological point of view. They also give us very good citizenship values as well. I have grown up reading at least 3 newspapers every day, 4 to 5 periodicals every week, all schools of thoughts. So I think that really helped me as an individual see and read a lot. And as I said, question as well a lot. But if you ask me particularly about what drew me to the idea or towards mental health, on hindsight now I see many people in extended family who probably had some form of mental health issues. But what I remember very clearly is when they were talked about, they were always spoken about with a lens of pity, never with a lens of empathy. And that is something I was as a child, of course, did not have the vocabulary. I did not know how to, articulate that. But I remember thinking very well that, did anybody ask him how is he feeling about that? There's a particular person in my mind who I'm sorry. Of course, I will not take anybody's name here. Another important thing that also stayed with me was, as a child, I watched a film called Khamoshi. It talks about a relationship, or rather a bonding, the affection. I would not call it romance. I would call it more of an affection, a care between a psychiatric nurse and an inmate of a psychiatric institution, which were previously known as lunatic asylums. It has famous, beautiful songs. There's Dharmender, there's Wahida Rehman, and there is Rajesh Khanna. Amazing songs. But one thing I remember very clearly, and I don't know if it sounds very filmy, when I was watching that film, I cried a lot. I cried hell a lot. I was very, very young. And my father said, why do you cry so much for these people? I'm sorry for saying it, I don't know if everybody understands Hindi here. My father said, beta wo pagal hai, kya kar sakte hain? As in I said, pata nahi wo pagal hain ya hum.
Wow.
I said that. And that is something especially when I went to TISS, like long jump from the little Fawzia to the much older version. I remember this discussion, I was to always say that, why is it, who decides what's normal and what's abnormal?
Yeah.
So, and especially when I was staying in Mumbai, during my TISS days, the local train, the scene that I used to see, how people used to try and board the trains, and the chaos it was, how competitive we were acting. We were not looking, not thinking about the person next to us. So I really said that, and repeat of the same thing. My father again was with me to support me during that journey. My parents came from Allahabad to Bombay. And that time I said the same thing. I said, we are visiting this thing. So my father said, तुम्हारा बचपन से ये चीज़ था, तुम्हारा अभी भी उन्हीं में interest है, उन्हीं की दुनिया में. And then I explained that more in detail. The little Fawzia said one sentence. The older Fawzia had a better vocabulary thanks to TISS. And I said, Abu, हम लोग जिस तरह भाग भाग के ट्रेन पकड़ते हैं, एक दूसरे का ख्याल नहीं करते, कोई किसी को धक्का दे देता है, पूछते नहीं कि उसने खाना खाया है नहीं. If you go to a mental health institution, there people are more sensitive, more caring for each other. तो पता नहीं वो पागल हैं या हम. उनको एक दूसरे का ख्याल ज़्यादा है as opposed to us. Because I starkly remember this very, very, very vivid memories of the entire local train, this thing. But I used to always find that we've become very unkind in trying to get to where we want to go. And in that context that I said to my father the same thing that I told you just now. So that's little Fawzia's journey from watching Khamoshi, from seeing people around her, and as I said, a family being a lot into reading and talking and questioning, where even women were allowed to question, to ask that, and coming from a family of people who believed in women's education. So I think that's the journey we can start with.
For me, Khamoshi, one of the things that remained was the picturization and the lyrics of Wo Sham Kuch Ajeeb Thi.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It did have a lot of depth when I heard it for the first time when I was learning Hindi as a second language. And for a little girl to see the movie, yes, is very strong in its storytelling, but very subtle in the acting. And it makes you think a lot. But that impression that you had as that little girl watching and making that refrain, that statement that became your statement years later as well, this contemplation came from the books you read, the atmosphere you were brought up in, or the freedom to ask questions. Now, on hindsight, where do you think all of this emerged, or the school that you studied?
All of them. I would not say it's a single factor. It's a khichdi of all of them put together, and it's a beautiful khichdi of that. So I would not be able to give, emphasize that this factor was more important or that was more. My mother played a very important role in, allowing the girls to study, not believing that girls should only be doing the household chores or only boys should be doing this or that. So those kind of, I would not deny, they were gendered expectations, but not when it comes to the academic things, right? So I think as parents and being brought up in a joint family, and a joint family in a very unique sense, because my father's younger sister and her husband, so post marriage they stayed in the same house, which is not very common. Like mostly two brothers stay, but not the brother and a married sister. And seeing the equation between my grandmom, my mother, and my aunt, and how beautifully they managed, despite honestly, especially now as a psychologist, I can see it more clearly, they were very temperamentally very, very different. But they were able to handle their differences in a very, I would say, in a very, as you use the word, subtle way, without being unassertive, without being aggressive, in a very healthy way. I think that they gave me many life lessons, and that has impacted me in every sphere of life, be it my profession, be it other choices that I've made in life, how to deal with differences. I think that's really helped me. So my family was also very important in this, as I said, the family setup. And as I said, father's cousins, father's younger sister, the husband, grandparents, father, and 3 siblings. There were 10 people, later 9. So 10 of us together, having our dinners together. And now when we emphasize a lot on eating in silence or more in silence, like eating without any digital devices, I'm like, wow, I was blessed to have that childhood, because we used to all sit together, and there's a culture in our family of having post-dinner discussions. So we used to really have like long discussions after that. Like it could be something very random as well, something very gossipy as well, but we'd really have lots of conversations. So I think the art of conversations and the importance of conversations in family members, that has also stayed with me. So till now, despite everything, even if I have to have my food alone, Rashmi, honestly, I can't have my food with any television or any mobile or anything around me. For me, it is just my food and my plate that I have, or mostly like with my entire family, like now with my husband and children as well. So the foundations were laid with my family of origin, to put it this way.
This actually is one of those ideal pictures that we would like to have. We talk about happy childhood.
Right.
Thankfully for that generation which didn't have social media like it has today, I think most of us had happy childhood memories. How were you as a student?
I was standing out a couple of times, but never outstanding. I wasn't the one whom students envied. I was the one who was, I remember somebody saying in class 9th or 10th, I remember this was a beautiful compliment that she gave me. In some ways, I don't know why, maybe it was like a precursor to this thing. I became the entire class agony aunt that time. But that was much later. Earlier in childhood, I would say my school journey, there's one bit that I'd like to add because you're talking about childhood. When I entered St. Mary's Convent, that time I wasn't very fluent in English because we insisted on speaking in our mother tongue, Urdu, at home. Even though my mother and my older sister, my older brother, they all used to speak in English only. The other family members, as a family, used to speak in Urdu. So there was initially a struggle for me in the school, right, to be accepted. Because I wasn't fluent in that language, and because all the girls in my class by that time were very fluent in the language. That's when, one of my best relationships. All relationships are God gifted, but this I would say is my choice, is where I met my best friend, Aparna. I met her in 2nd standard in St. Mary's Convent. And probably the way we accepted each other, the way we understood each other, so that initial feeling of isolation, she very beautifully took care of it without ever making me feel that she's obliging me or she's being kind to me. The kindness was very understated. The kindness was kind of wrapped in in just genuine gestures of friendship. So I think that was a tough time for me when I think back as a childhood, to adjust to a new school, to feel accepted there. But in every journey, we'll all realize there's always somebody who helps us there. And for me, it was my friendship. And I'm very blessed, Rashmi. Till date, Aparna and I continue to be best friends. I have many other school friends. There's Tina, there's Rashi, there's Komal, like many other friends of them. But Aparna and I, we started first. And then, of course, gang grew in size, but she was my co-voyager during my difficult times, and she continues to be that. And rather, I would say we continue to be there in each other's life. So that was something that I wanted to add about my childhood. But as a student, I would say a mixed bag. I was good with the social sciences as expected, like history, geography, civics. I never had a problem. English, Hindi, I was like, not to say too good, but I was there, like among the best of the class. Like especially in Hindi debates and everything, I has to participate. Even in English and Hindi debates and elocution. Maths and physics were better knower. So they were like, bhai isse mat baat karo. I never understood mathematics and physics never understood me. Chemistry and biology were like decent enough. Okay. So I wouldn't say that any teacher disliked me. I would agree that I was a favorite of a couple of teachers, especially with the Hindi and Hindi teachers, or maybe sometimes history teacher as well. They used to like me a lot, but of course never the maths teacher and never the physics teacher. Right? So as I said, it was a mixed situation.
What made you choose psychology?
I am coughing not only because I have a cold. I am also coughing because sometimes stressful memories also evoke certain physiological reactions. Not entering into any kind of pity party kind of a thing. But it took me a little time to convince my family about the importance of studying psychology. My family in particular wanted me to do management and work for an MNC, work for a bank. That's like what, achhe bache, they do. And psychology was something they were not very well, they didn't know much about. They were not against it, but they were like, my father being from a service camp background, of course wanted all his 3 children to be, part of a stable workforce. So study well, and if not a government job, join a private organization as well, but study hard and be in a stable job. Now, never the business side and never in anything else. So it took me a little while to convince them. So initially I studied commerce, honestly. But that, I would say they were the most difficult years of my life. Commerce never liked me, I never liked commerce, but somehow I managed to scrape through, not a great student there, but just managed to scrape through that. Those 3 years of undergraduation were a tough time for me. But after that, I was able to kind of mildly convince my family, and I studied organizational psychology for my master's. Because that was kind of an amalgamation of courses. Students from law were there, students from management were there, students from commerce were there, and of course biology and psychology students were also there. So we had a beautiful motley group of students. And in part of that course, the organizational we were taught a small, I think 25 mark or 50 mark paper called Counseling Skill for Managers. And I think I do not know if I excelled there or not, but I think I loved that class. I remember every class of that in detail. And after that, I was 100% convinced that I would never be a healthy fit in a corporate situation. I would always want to do something in the mental health stream as well. It was not a linear my journey took psychology and everything. So my M.Psych, by the time I finished that, I was already absorbed by the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, to be an academic associate for the OB area. When I was at IIM Ahmedabad, people thought it was the best thing for me to happen. But honestly, if I look at the entire journey, I think the best thing that happened to me was my TISS choice. And TISS happened to me after marriage, after motherhood. After my younger son was born, I was very sure that this is where I wanted to be. And may the Almighty always be very kind to my husband, who saw that. He was like, I can see it in you, you are not meant for the corporate world. Neither will you enjoy there, nor will they somebody like you. So it's better that you do what you really want to do. I did what my heart and soul was always into. And I think TISS was the best 2 years. I don't know if I can call it the bestest 2 years, grammatically incorrect, but definitely close to more experience-wise. They were the best. I think it was the best choice that I've made in life. I'm very happy that I did the TISS course. Not only in terms of the prestigious institution, not only because the members of the faculty were great at what they were teaching. I think, as I said, as a child, the curiosity that I had, TISS gave me that political vocabulary. My first class there, I remember the professor asked me, Dr. Aparna Joshi, one of my favorite teachers there, and she said, I want all of you to write down your definitions of abnormalcy. And I said, if you don't cause anybody any harm, you are normal. If you don't cause yourself harm, if you don't cause anybody else harm, you are absolutely normal. So the kind of, the thought that was ingrained in me, the kind of questioning that I got to, the political stance that we took, what she taught me, that personal is political. I really, really stand by it. And today I feel that that's a beautiful way of saying it, that you stand for whatever you are doing, right? So that thing of personal being political, I think that stayed with me. So not because I'm repeating, not because it is a prestigious institution, not because it is a world famed this thing. Even if I had done it from probably NIMHANS, I would not have been as happy as I've done it from TISS. I think I'm repeating this. किसी ने अच्छी दुआ दी होगी, किसी ने कुछ. I must have done some little good thing in life that I got into TISS, and much more than what the textbooks could teach me, I learned from there.
Okay.
A lot.
And what did you specialize in?
Counseling psychology.
Okay, counseling.
I chose counseling.
Okay, so from that master's that you did,
This was my second master's.
yeah, this was your second master's, where that's one subject of counseling for managers took you into counseling psychology.
Rishmi, I always wanted to just be in this field, as I said, but it took me a little time to convince people that this field of work has a lot of scope, and even if it didn't have a scope, I wanted to be there, and honestly, people feel that probably I would be very happy at IIM. I was happy, but I was happier and happiest at TISS. Right. So I think that will help you see the big picture as it is.
But Fawzia, I'm very curious at this point. When you chose counseling, was it your work at IIM that told you that counseling is what you like to do, because you continued being that agony aunt back in school again in IIM, that you realized that by nature you were a good listener and people would just confide in you very easily? Was that what drew you into understanding and filtering options that you really enjoy?
Definitely. I think I knew that I wanted to be in the mental health stream. Even in psychology, I did not want to go into the business side of psychology, because psychology is a vast this thing. For me, psychology meant that I wanted to understand human beings. I wanted to work with human beings. I wanted to work for human beings, and specifically with the psychotherapy area, or the mental health stream as we call it. So it's very sure. I would not know, and when you asked this, I just reminded of something that one of my classmates said when I was doing my MSci. They said, I think, Fawzia, you would be better as a therapist or better as a counselor, not not as any HR or OD this thing in an corporate. Even when I was teaching, like the same course that I did at Allahabad, after IIM I came back and I worked at Allahabad University again at my alma mater. And I remember one of my students saying the same thing, that, ma'am, even though you teach us very well, which was very kind of them to say that, they said, we think that you will make an amazing therapist. So I think these things did help me understand that there is something, as we say in career counseling parlance, that wherever the interest and your aptitude, they match, it's a beautiful choice for you to make that as your calling. That becomes your calling, right? So it's being from Allahabad, I think I can give you this analogy of Triveni Sangam, right? So where your personality, your aptitude and your interest, where they come together, you have a Prayagraj. So it becomes the holy pilgrimage site. So I realized that I am interested in knowing people's story, in being there for them, not necessarily in the capacity of a solution provider, but just as as providing that with them with that safe space. Honestly, I did not even know this term of safe space. I was just like, I hope they're like, it is okay that they're able to confide in me. If they feel good about it, I'm okay doing that. So, and as I said, people were very kind. I got the required feedback, which propelled me towards this. So, the combination of interest and aptitude helped me do this. And definitely, as I said, my husband was very supportive. He said, "No, I think you should forget about everything else. Just do what you want to. You would make a." He also said that I'll make a good therapist. So that stayed with me.
And now that you've been in this space, how would you define a therapist? How would you define
A good therapist? A good therapist is one whom you feel connected with. So that is very subjective experience for the client.
Yeah.
It would never be that there's one therapist who's a good therapist for every client, because every client comes with a different experience. Every client has a very different cultural, socio-political context to their story. Right? It's not that we need to share the same context to be able to understand them, but sometimes it does help, right? And even when it comes to the schools of psychology, even when it comes to the skills of a therapist, you may be the best therapist, but you would not be a good fit for many of the clients, and does not make you a bad therapist. That does not make them resistant clients. There's nothing thing as resistant client, honestly, but just to help our people understand. So you would be a good, as I said, any therapist would be a good therapist for somebody the client feels well connected with, where the client feels that I can come back to this place whenever I wish to. I feel, the word that you use, I feel a sense of calmness here. I feel seen here. I feel heard here. I feel understood. I feel validated. Right? Something that I say for my best friend Aparna, that she understands me the way I wish to be understood. So, therapist is somebody who understands you. Yeah. Of course, not our work does not stop at just understanding. It goes beyond that. But that lays the foundation for the work to begin. So it has to be a good client and therapist fit. That would depend, as I said, on what the client needs are and what the therapist skills and school of psychology and attitude and demeanor and all those things are.
Thank you for that definition, because not everyone who studies is most likely to be one of the best in that space. There's a lot that is internally there, which is your attitude, which comes out while you listen to people. And one of the major requirements is being a good listener, non-judgmental.
Of course.
So on this journey, Fauzia, as you were progressing, when you finished this, you were in Mumbai, and now you are in Bangalore. So where did the journey take you?
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, a little break, not a break in the journey, but a little bump. My children were very young that time. Okay. And as I said, when I was studying at TISS, my parents and my aunt and her husband, as I said, from my joint family, and from my in-laws, my parents-in-law, they all supported throughout the 2-year journey. But after that, being senior citizens, they had their own health challenges. They had their own calling and yearning for Allahabad, so they couldn't stay longer in Mumbai. So I chose a work which allowed me to work from home that time. And that time, the entire concept of online counseling was not much in vogue, so to say. And those people were kind enough. And my work that time was an amalgamation of my first master's with my second master's. So there we were working with it was more like psychometrics, as we call that, helping organization find the right candidates for different roles. Not just in terms of knowledge, but in terms of the attitude that they carry. Do they have the temperamental fit for that? Do they have the required attitude for that? To give you a very basic example, like for somebody who's a lot into research, does not require necessarily to be an extrovert. Would be very happy doing lots concentrated work, having good amount of focus, and be very very happy in his or her own world. But somebody who needs to be in a very something like a people focusing role, let's say something like like a salesperson, needs to be somebody who's a little extroverted.
Yeah.
It's a basic temperamental traits coupled with a few skills. So we're just trying to understand. So organization would give us a requirement that these are the kind of roles. So we design a test accordingly to find if they were suitable. The same thing, person role fit. There's a person role fit and person organization fit. So there's a client therapist fit, and similarly that fit also had to be happening. So for 1 or 2 years I was there. And then my husband got a transfer to Bangalore. I shifted along with him. And here then, I quit that role because by that time my children had also grown up. And I joined a hospital nearby and also started my independent practice. Then I joined, I don't know if you're aware of that. You've heard of Culfit, I'm sure, right? So Culfit that time had a MindFit division as well. So I worked with them as a therapist for close to 2 years. And then Corona hit. And things changed a lot. And then I left there. And then I started, since 2019, I've been fully absorbed into independent practice. Of course, I am in collaboration with a couple of hospitals where I go like as a consultant. But primarily I'm into independent practice because now my clients are from all over India and some even from outside of India. Thanks to Zoom meetings.
Honestly, I think even this podcast continues because of
Exactly. And honestly, they offer us privacy. There's good audio, video, this thing. I think it works beautifully for us. Thanks to Zoom. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. And when we are talking about your journey, Fauziya, today, yes, people talk mental health openly. And we have a day like October 10th, which is celebrated or observed as well. But when you were in that space, it was still, not many people say that I'm going to see a counselor.
Even now they don't say it.
Oh, really? I thought now it's a little more open than what it was when you say I'm going to see a psychologist.
Under 30s, the young adults and adolescents have a different worldview. Yeah. Older adults, especially male clients, have a different, so like 30 plus, 40 plus have a different.
This clientele that you catered to at that point in time, did it, and you said COVID was the time when you moved online. Did online somewhere help you understand that people were now coming out because it's online, so people don't even see you entering a clinic?
There were two sides to this, I'll tell you. Allow me to elaborate. So as you said, like when you have a physical clinic, sometimes people have this concern that they'll park their car a little ahead and then they'll come walk to your clinic because they don't want their car to be seen around your clinic. That's one thing. But definitely Zoom allowed people the concept of privacy, talking, which too, I can't take this away, was also little, for some people still a struggle. Not everybody had access to a laptop or to a phone or even to a private space. And with Corona hitting, many people were forced to be together. So many can of worms were opened from because we were staying apart, things were better now, but when people were staying together, so the familiarity again started breeding in contempt, right? So we were not prepared to be with each other 24/7. So not only the physical space limitation, but also sharing the same psychological, emotional space was also tough for people. So some people definitely who had that access, definitely, thankfully, hopefully were helped. But I would not take away the fact that I still feel that many of the communities could not be served very well because of the infrastructural deficits, right? Because they did not have access to good internet speed. That comes with that's also a privilege, right? Not everybody has that. Or people who stay, big families in small spaces, in congested spaces, right? They cannot. So I have, as much as we did not do this earlier, we were very textbook style. No, I have had clients, especially, and I'm talking about the Mumbai context, who are sitting in a park and talking to me using their Zoom on their mobile phones because they could not do it from their homes. And I had to keep everything aside. I was like, and I discussed this with my supervisor. She said, no, we have to work with the times. So definitely we can do this. So that was, of course, for us also a huge learning curve, a major leap of faith that we also as therapists took, that earlier we used to also online therapy does not work. Oh, that's not good work. But life changes, we change, we also accepted that. The same thing. So definitely many people did accept, and thanks to the in some ways the pandemic of Corona is also a pandemic of anxiety, a pandemic of other forms of mental health concerns. Anxiety was just like the common cold or fever as we have in physical health. But at least people started talking about it. As we call the elephant in the room started getting addressed. People started having the vocabulary. Now, of course, there's a lot of psychobabble in this as well. Some people use it loosely as well. But still, now people use terms like trauma, people use terms like gaslighting, using terms even people earlier would be not using terms like anxiety or depression so commonly. They say, I'm just sad. But now they're able to understand the difference between clinical depression and sadness. So in some ways, pandemic did give us that vocabulary, that understanding. And definitely the young adults that we have, they were very open about it. They were very vocal about it. Thanks to their openness, they being amenable to the concept of therapy. Even later, the older generations also started taking, they were okay with the middle-aged people, the senior citizens were also like, okay, this can also be explored. When we were confined, and how I put it is that this was like a situation where even the doctors did not know. It was like an out-of-syllabus question for them as well. It was something very, very unusual. Rashmi, did you know the word quarantine before that? I don't know. I never knew that. I think we'd heard of the word epidemic, but never the word pandemic. Our vocabulary also grew. We were also facing in situations, it was one day at a time. So I think the anxiety of, as we call it, of not knowing what tomorrow will bring. How many lives will it take? What if something happens to me? What if something happens to my loved ones? So many people lost their jobs. So many people were working but not getting the full payment. So many people who did not want to be together had to be together. Couples at odds with each other, parents and children who were not having the same worldview, in-laws and daughters-in-law. So we had all these struggles that time. But the entire pandemic situation taught us that what are we able to handle well and what we are not able to tolerate well. Anxiety, we say, is the classic definition of that is the intolerance of uncertainty. So when I don't know what tomorrow will bring, if I'm at ease with that, or if I'm neutral, I will not feel anxious. But if I'm concerned, kal kya hoga, what will tomorrow bring, what will be day after, I should prepare for 10 years later. If I'm not able to tolerate that lack of certainty, then I become anxious. And pandemic put that thing right in our face, like, now look at it, you don't know what tomorrow will happen. I think that's why we understood that there is something called anxiety, and it's a genuine clinical condition, it's genuine mental health difficulty that people do get troubled by time to time, and which needs help, professional help.
This is actually very deep when you start listening and understanding this concept, that suddenly feelings got names which people could understand and everyone knew what we are talking about. Like you said, yes, at the cost of using some terms very loosely because people were using it. But what I find very interesting, Fozia, is when you spoke about the younger generation. Okay? They were going through COVID like us for the first time. Even we didn't know how to handle it. The younger generation, the current Gen Z that we're talking about, who may not have expressed all that they're going through at that point of time, and therefore there is something which has shifted in the way they're looking at life. Like you said, life is temporary. Everything turns into dust any which way. So therefore, why save for a tomorrow that we don't even know? Do you have certain story of how different generations look at life?
Giving you details of the story, I'll start with this. And as I said earlier, I'm grateful to the Gen Zs, as we call them, or as we call them as adolescents and young adults. The young adults are primarily the Gen Zs right now. The young adults, as we call them, they were the ones who were most open to the idea of therapy. They struggled a lot. Just when they were entering the workforce, or just when they were about to graduate from their college, all these things happened. Even the people who were that time who were in school, many times we call them, oh, these are COVID children, they don't know enough because they were doing online classes. So there are also biases and stereotypes there as well. We don't take that away. But they opened the world for the others to talk about mental health. So that's one thing. But I think, they are still more open to the concept of talking to somebody who's non-judgmental and who assures you of confidentiality. Versus people, and of course these are more, there'd always be exceptions, there'll always be aberrations to this. Versus, especially in the Indian context, we have a lot of this thing of belief about family honor, prestige, घर की बात बाहर नहीं जानी चाहिए, right? So people took a little while to chew this idea, to accept it. They kind of glanced at it, took and then took a step back. फिर झांका, फिर कहा चलो थोड़ा सा try करते हैं. This was like a peep and go kind of a thing, and then gradually they stepped into this. That time, like for them, the world always, their therapist was always their family members. And even if it was not real therapy, that was the belief was. I would not say that was real therapy, but that was the belief was. But as opposed, as I said, the young adults are more open to talk about these things as well. The young adults being people who are more in tune with the psychological vocabulary use these terms. Of course, there'd always be people and across generations who may use the terms little loosely, but at least we are glad that let's not throw the baby with the bathwater. Let's accept that at least people have started talking about it. Otherwise, the other, as you said, थोड़ा सा वो कम हुआ है, right? थोड़ी सी बातचीत हुई. You see how even newspapers, right? They start talking about. Even you see like podcasts, stories. I would say, I think people who came from marginalized backgrounds, they came up to me like this is I'm sharing as a therapist. I had many of the people from the marginalized community coming for therapy during the COVID times. Marginalized in different sense of the term. Some because of their gender, some because of their religious community that they belong to, some because of their affectionate orientation, some because of their linguistic English speaking versus non-English speaking, that the class divide that we also have. In India, of course, the caste is a very big, we can't take that away, that experience from people's this thing, right? So minority in any form, the perception of not seeing enough, the lived in experience and the belief of not being valued enough, of being judged or having stereotypes with you, right? So they came up with a lot of experience of that. So I think because I said they had that mobile phones, and whenever they could find some privacy, they'd come for a therapy session, and if they see the therapist is equally fluent in Hindi and Urdu or any other regional any other Indian language, right, non-English speaking as well, has the understanding of being rooted in cultural context, understands politics, they were very open to talk about those experiences as well. Which I see, there's a little hesitation to talk about those things, not to say that the lived-in experiences are different. And of course, there'll be some variation here and there, but there's a hesitation to to put the accountability where it belongs to, right? So it's like, oh, I am feeling this, I am feeling that, but we also need to have to gradually bring into that, like, how are you? As you asked me about my childhood. So about their childhood, their adolescence, were they allowed to meet and mix with the other gender? Which language were they taught in at their school? And then they open up and like, okay, there could also be systemic issues, like somebody being from for any kind of a persecution at any level, like overt or covert, or anybody, any kind of a, what we call as even persons with disability, right? You and I have the privilege of looking at each other, of talking to each other, people with different communication difficulties, or visual challenges, even neurodivergence, right? So I think we started talking about these things, right? But with you repeating this, that the people in their 30s, 40s, and sometimes a couple of my clients are also in their 50s and 60s as well. With the geriatric population, a lot of focus is on the symptoms only. It's almost like they're meeting a doctor. And they'll be like, oh, you'll give me 15 minutes. Oh, you want me to tell more? So like, yes, please, I'm Jin. I want to listen to you. I want to hear your story. I just don't want a list of symptoms, right? So there's a little shift there. So then helping them understand very gradually, not pushing myself, just very gradually what were the experiences, and then using the right vocabulary, the TISS vocabulary, as I put it, right? That helped them that, okay, so not everything that, that happens here is only happening here. It is also happening around us. And then what is happening here also has a bearing on what is happening here. So the mind-body connection, the cultural context, that was all brought into, like, we talked about that. But because the young adults, the adolescents, they are more net savvy, spending more time on the social media, reading a lot about this, authentic and both inauthentic sources as well. but at least asking questions, saying that could this be not only talking about symptoms, but also talking about experiences, and saying, no, 50 minutes is my time, this is my space, I want to talk about it. So that shift, I would say, was very quite noticeable for me as a therapist as well.
You have a story, Fazia, where today when you look back, that was the story that made you realize you are on the chosen path and you have found your path.
I'm drawn towards this. It is not that, because we hear very difficult stories. We hear stories of even violence as well, of ongoing violence as well. And Rashmi, I'm digressing a little because I'm using the word violence. There's so much of violence that we are seeing in the world around us. You feel like, what are we talking about in a kind of a little bubble? And there are people who actually are facing, who don't know if they'll see actually tomorrow, right? Who are really standing in long, never-ending queues just to get a bowl of food. So it's not that all my clients are very privileged, so to say. They all have their challenges, and hence they are willing to come to therapy as well. Some just are very curious about therapy, and hence they are in therapy. But some of them have had a very, very tough life, right? And as much as I am very empathetic to the struggles that they have, I'm also very proud of how resilient they have been. Of the kind of whatever as much as life has been demanding a lot from them, extracting a lot from them, I would not say that they've come out a winner, but they've been a very strong survivor. They've been facing the bully called life and difficult circumstances, right? They've not given up. That, again, as a therapist, I would say it's not a kind of work that anybody would enjoy. It is not कि आज बड़ा मजा आया बहुत ही traumatic story. So never that. But it's always like that. Oh my God, what has he or she gone through? But look at the amazing resilience and courage and the hope that they bring. Okay. That has helped me be very sure that this is where I want to be. Definitely feedback from the clients, definitely feedback from the supervisor, feedback from my own therapist as to how I'm doing in my mental health, because as therapists, we definitely need to always have a therapist for ourselves, right? So taking the feedback and maintaining ethics of like not overburdening myself with too many clients and too much of work, honestly, I'm very sure that I am in the right place and I want to continue here. I just, being little, not little, but quite spiritually grounded, I always begin my session by like, Almighty help me to help this client so that that client can help themselves. That's what we always say in counseling psychology, that we help them so that they can help themselves. So I always start with that silent prayer that I know that if I'm not able to do anything good, at least I should not be able to do any harm to them. Non-harming stance is very strong for us as a counseling psychologist. I think I begin with that, and I'm content doing what I am doing. Definitely, I've got lots and lots to learn. It's not something. It's a continuous learning journey. But there's not one single thing, Rashmi, to answer a question where I say, okay, that this is the moment where I thought that this has been my calling. I think, as I said, from I was drawn towards this. Life gave me different kind of experiences. But now where I am here, I know that this is where I want to be for all my productive years. No questions about that. That's something I'm very repeating, that TISS was the best choice, and being in this profession is it's something that I find very grounding and anchoring for myself.
A client who came to you who was difficult for you initially because you had no clue how to handle this, but when they finished the therapy with you and they left, what they told you made you understand certain things because you spoke about resilience. Have you had any challenging moments where you met someone and it challenged every skill in you to bring out the best in that person?
There's a client of mine. She's had she had an abusive parent. One parent abusive, the other parent negligent. And many people sometimes feel that a common myth that people have is that those who have been abused turn out to be abusers themselves. Thankfully, despite all that happened, there are many people, and of course we never believe that all people who've been abused turn out to be abusers, but she had a complete 180 degree shift from her. She's very protective about the young children around her. She's very cued in, as to how she takes care of like siblings and cousins and students and everybody. So there's no, as I said, there's no self-pity, there's no victimhood there. There's an understanding that what happened to me, and since you said that it was difficult, what was the challenging part was, which is very common in this, is that there's a lot of self-blame with people, and that's very we see that commonly in people who've been abused as with CSA survivors. And in her case, the abuse was ongoing in a different form, but the abuse was ongoing. So I don't know. She's been in therapy with me now for I think 4.5 years. Very regular client. There's no one moment of breakthrough, but I would say post the second or the third year, she's now been able to not shift the blame, but at least call out people, put this accountability exactly on the shoulders where it belongs to. At least her vocabulary has shifted from self-blame to self-compassion. Self-compassion is still I'm working on. At least the self-blame I've been able to, we've been together able to work on that. She was one of somebody whom I not just work with, but deeply admire as an individual. And definitely to start work with her, because she comes from a very, very different cultural context. She doesn't speak any of the Indian languages as well. It's a very different cultural context for me. But working with her, the fact that she trusted me, the fact that she believed in the process of therapy, I think that really helped her and helped me to help her again, right? And that's, I think, something that I'll always carry when she say that, yes, now I'm able to see that I am the one who has been abused, and it is never it is never the survivor's fault. Because we always say, rule number 1, it is not your fault. Rule number 2, when in doubt, refer to rule number 1. That is something we always go back when we talk about CSA, child sexual abuse, or any form of abuse for that matter. So it took a lot of work from her end, from collaboratively we did that, and finally she accepts that self-compassion is still something we need to build more on. The reservoir is still very limited. At least we've stopped her self-blame language, so she's not using the self-blaming language anymore, and she's able to see abuse now as it is.
Even if you take she is one who is ostracized by society, and there's so much of self-blame in her rather than the abuser. And
Exactly.
he's never seen as somebody who is the one who needs to be punished. It is very sad but true. And the trauma that the victim goes through is something that is inexplicable. It's unimaginable for anyone to understand what
Right.
she would have gone through at that time. And today it's not she alone, it's he also.
Yeah. And yeah, honestly, Rashmi, he's find it very difficult to talk about it.
Yeah.
It's so difficult to let men talk, when boys and men, they talk about their experiences of sexual abuse. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of rapport building, it takes a really deep amount of faith in the therapist's ability that then they open up and they talk about that abuse. Otherwise, as I said now, they always talk about the anxiety, they talk about the depression, they talk about the perfectionism, they always talk about the symptoms. They don't talk about what brought about that. Why are they so anxious always? Why do they always look out? Why they are startled when somebody touches them unknowingly? So we shift the focus from the symptoms to why is that happening? Why is your body taking care of you so much? Why is it being so protective? So, and yes, thank you for bringing that out. When a man is able to talk about this, you're like, thank God you allowed us. You trusted us with this. So thank you for that. Very few men talk about that. Not that they are not, they don't have such experiences, but they don't talk about it. They find it more difficult to talk about it.
That's so true. Any tips that you would like to give, Fawzia, for us to take care of our mental health? Because many of us don't even express it. We don't even know that we are going through fatigue mentally because we are so much in the busyness of the business that we are in. How do we pick up signs? How do we just walk away and take care?
I would say take care of the basics like the food, the hydration, the sleep, right? Very basic things. When I say eating healthy, I mean like eating more of home, less of ultra processed foods, more of natural foods, straight from the farm to your plate, right? Keeping yourself well hydrated, right? Sipping on water, not gulping on water, something I very emphasize a lot on. Sleeping on, like maintaining the sleep hygiene. Of course, there'll be days when you're not able to sleep very well, but other than that, try and maintain, give yourself rest basically. Allow and believe that you deserve rest, right? Not pushing yourself too much. That would be on the basic. Something that we've not spoken about, I just want to add one or two lines about that, is the concept of we human beings always being connected, right? So not being wired to gadgets and electronic devices, but being connected with one another. So that there's also a pandemic of loneliness that we are seeing. So having human to human connection, at least one or two people whom you can talk to, right? If it is not your friends, if it is not your family members, definitely a therapist, right? But we have to have that person in our life. So, and in general, just having more connections around, just random, even in this online world, if you can go and just say, no, अपने दूध वाले भाई को या अपने जो दीदी काम करती है उनको हाय हेलो कहना, like looking away from the screen, as simple as that, right? And something that I personally find very relaxing and soothing that you talk about, in terms of the safe space or the calm space, is to have some time in the day when you sit with stillness, when you do nothing, when you allow yourself to feel in your body what your body wants you to hear, right? So instead of it coming out as anxiety, as depression, as XYZ, you sit with your body and you listen to that, right? And when I talk about body, definitely it needs movement. So make sure that you do something, that you perspire well. Don't always sit in AC environments where you don't. So step out, move around, talk to people, have enough of exposure to outdoors. Right? Basics. And something I also use for myself, not for others, is the concept of spiritual grounding and anchoring. Whatever be your belief, even if you are an atheist, it's having a larger calling, having a purpose in life, having that hope, especially the hopelessness that we are seeing in students, right? The ability to tolerate failures and frustrations, right? So that also helps if we have enough spiritual grounding and anchoring. That would be helpful. I think we have enough tips for that, right?
Yes. The space is so huge.
Right.
Loneliness pandemic that you spoke about. Parenting today is another big topic.
Exactly. I think we will talk about that in another one week of podcast.
Yes. Yeah,
right.
we have a lot to talk about. But before you leave, 3 life lessons, Fawzia.
Authenticity, empathy are some things I think we all need. We need for ourselves, we need to extend to the others. And keep it simple, keep it basic. So even when it comes to mental health tips, I would say the same thing, right? Food, water, sleep, and all those things. Okay, we don't need big words, we don't need jargons, we don't need anything. Even for community mental health, we always say the same. It's the simple, it's the basic thing that always work. Consistency and basic things every day really helps us. So I think these would be my life lessons. The empathy part of empathy to self, empathy to others, like self-compassion and empathy, and definitely keeping everything very basic, very simple, and grounded, my favorite word, anchored and grounded.
Thank you so very much, Fawzia. Lessons that you spoke about itself spoke with depth of who you are, made us understand that mental health is not as simple as we make it out to be. Words cannot be loosely used. That stillness you spoke about, the depth of connections that you spoke about, that grounding that you're talking about are all required in today's world where we are connected globally, connected internally.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank
So
you.
well put.
And God bless you for the work that you do, the difference
Thank
that
you.
make in.
Thank you so much, Rashmi. And I would also like to say, Rashmi, every Fawzia needs a Rashmi. For somebody who sees that the worth of this work, not as an individual, but whatever we are doing. I think more than therapists, we need more mental health allies. So thank you so much, and God bless you. May we have more mental health allies in this world. We really need. Thanks, Rashmi, for being you.
Thank you so much, Fawzia.
With that, we complete this episode of You and I with Rashmi Shetty. Do let us know if you know inspirational people whose story needs to be heard. You can write in at rashmi.thethirdeye@gmail.com. That is rashmi.thethirdeye@gmail.com.